Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Charlotte. In terms of, Mark, you've really inspired me to actually get up and do something this evening. I'm going to make something. I'm going to play with Arisma, and I'll finish chair. I'm going to run out the room really quickly. But just picking up on your final point there, you've laid down the gauntlet to a certain extent to the audience and invited everyone to participate in some of your quick wins, which takes us back, to a certain extent, back to my original question, which was framed around this notion of brochureware from the early 90s. And the phrase of the David and Goliath situation comes back to mind in terms of, I completely agree with you, big brands are Neanderthal to a certain extent, and other than some of the viral small fires that they're lighting, it tends to be very, very safe, and it's a much slower machine. But as SMEs, we're in a strong position to compete. So we've heard a lot in terms of moving on from the brochureware into integrated approaches, connected strategies to advertising and PR, from developing brand advocacy through co-creation, everything from partner-based tweets through to audience-generated social media and content. Also, we've talked about optimization through responsive web and integration of existing web services, right the way down to the open source tools like the WordPresses and the free CMSs. So I'd like to start off the Q&A session to go back to this notion of kind of, I think the phrase service design is probably incorrect, and I guess that's my question now. What is the actual term that I'm looking for when I'm talking about service design for digital brands and businesses online? Anthony.
Oh, God. It's a very good question, and I only partially understand it. Would you like to go?
That's a pop out. When you mean service design, you're talking around the kind of whole brochureware thing.
Well, moving past brochureware more towards in terms of, I guess it sits more with digital brands.
Yeah.
In terms of a digital brand lives by being a service.
Yeah.
Itself.
So here's the thing, you know, which is everybody's talking about this, is about how brands essentially need to have a conversation with their consumers. And what you sometimes get with some of the bigger brands is they do a very good conversation on Twitter, but it's kind of siloed. Go and look at Royal Mail. They're great social media presence, but they utterly fail to deliver on the service. So I think from the point of view of an SME, you can actually be much more service focused, and you can have that conversation. And again, we talk about things like authenticity. In other words, do people believe you? You know, and again, smaller brands, smaller businesses can be much more authentic, and you can have that kind of conversation. And it is completely two-way, and that's because as consumers, we can respond wherever we are, whenever we want, through, you know, a whole multiplicity of channels. So as a brand, you've got to have that, you've got to be open to it, you've got to have that conversation. And, you know, so yeah, I think SMEs are probably best placed to do that.
Great, okay. Thank you. What I take from this is that I think now you need to be a lot more multi-channel. You offer a much richer experience than just a digital version of your brochure online, and you can now create conversations and people can answer back, and the more transparent and open to criticism you are and how you deal with that online really helps build your brand. So I think that the more risks you take and the more innovative you try to be and the more connected with your customer, and I think that's how new brands, existing brands, SMEs will create a sustainable competitive advantage, just to throw a marketing term in at the end for you. Charlotte.
All I would have to add is I hope that it's also about creating some loyalty, although it can also make us incredibly fickle. But you hope that you develop that brand personality and you want people to continue to use your service and engage with you and spend money with that business. But yeah, you know, it is a worry that we can just unfollow and we can just turn our attention elsewhere. But, you know, there has to be a reason for doing it.
Excellent. Thank you. Could we now take questions from the floor, please?
Good evenings. Stephen Evans Photography here. I studied marketing at Birmingham Polytechnic in 1981, but do you see that the digital media is more of as a great leveler between the small SMEs and the larger corporate companies?
Are they working?
Yes, apparently we're working up front. Who would like to take the question?
I think the
Charlotte?
obvious answer is yes. You know, I think it really has helped, and you know, even if I go back, I'm 32, but when I started my career in back end of '99, it was all about how big is your budget, and now it's more about what time have you got to dedicate to that. So, and I think, yeah, that is really exciting for smaller businesses, and it's given, I think, the big corporates something they've had to play catch up to.
A great opportunity for the small guy to get his message across, because there's so much noise out there for the advent of digital media. You have in the for the small guy versus the big guy trying to get his message through the communication channels. It's always been hard, but as you say, with the advent of digital media, you can adopt a strategy to.
Yeah. If you've got something to say, and also if you spend the time on it, you know, we all know if we've got Twitter accounts, the more time you spend on it, the greater the return. I don't spend as much time as I could, perhaps as much time as I should, and the returns are shown. But yeah, you can certainly, even as a one-man band, create a lot of noise and a lot of attention by putting the time in without it actually costing you something. Whereas, yeah, back 10 years ago, how would you have done something without money?
Yeah, it's a problem because for donkey's years, I used to advertise as a business in yellow pages under the corporate heading of British Institute of Professional Photography. Now, the yellow pages used to be like an equal publication, but they've done the Mars bar trick and they shrunk it down, and you can hardly read the typeface now. So, as last year, I said no, I'm not paying money for that. I'm trying to do things more.
Mark, you had a point?
I'm going to disagree slightly. I think the opportunity is there, but it's not level. And let's, I'm going to be realistic here. The fact is the big brands can dominate, and they do once they get going. So if you look at something like Google, there's a classic where BMW basically did something which got them banned, and they were so Google took their site down and they were back up in a few days, or their site off the search engines. Whereas a small business can't do that because they're very much focused on bringing that big advertising. And again, I know lots of small businesses who are spending a vast amount of money on pay-per-clicks and are doing it out of utter fear. And I've done in the past, I don't do it so much now, but I've done this kind of performance work and look at what they're doing, and I'll just look at the numbers and go, you do realise you're losing money on every click, effectively.
Yes, yeah.
But people dare not do it because if we don't do it, we're not there. So I think there is this problem that big brands will do that. They can have the investment to create some nice whizzy app that everybody ought to download. And use.
Have Google changed the way the manner in which you get ranked?
They're always changing it, and that, again, that's one of the big problems. If you're a big brand now, if you're a Kellogg's, you're always going to get found online. If you're a small brand and they change the algorithm, what happens? Suddenly people have gone from, first page rank, which brings an enormous amount of business, to last.
Donkeys years ago, it was meta tags, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, they know. I mean, it's changing almost on a monthly basis. So what I would say is the opportunities are there. What small businesses have on their side is what we call agile. It's that ability to get into those things. So whilst, the thing that popped up last year was Pinterest, which is really good at driving business too. And if I was you, if I was a photographer, I'd be looking particularly at Pinterest. And if I was a designer maker, I didn't mention it, but something like Etsy, you have a really great site, but they also have a really, really good mobile site, one of the best mobile commerce sites. And you do have the opportunity, you can get in there faster than a brand, you can get something out there, and you can be authentic and you can reach that local audience, but I don't think it's a leveller in the true sense of it, and the big brands still dominate.
We're starting to touch down on this notion of kind of separating communications for different audiences in different places. Are there any tips that the panel can give the audience in terms of how we create brand personalities in separate channels? For instance, Twitter's something which we keep returning to. You separate your communications within Birmingham Science Park, depending on your Twitter stream.
Yeah, I think because the first thing you see when you look at a Twitter profile is the number of followers. It means something. That when I started at the Science Park in February, I was appalled by the number of different Twitter accounts we have, and we've tried to kind of streamline that. But then for Soup of the Day, I don't want that on the corporate Twitter. So it's a bit of a balance, really. But it is very much about volume, but making sure that you're not turning people off at the same time, as in volume of followers and getting the message out there to a big audience instantaneously. But if there's rationale for having another handle to deal with another community, then that is a good approach, I would say.
We had a question from over here.
Well, I was picking up on that. Alex Chambers from Squisito Deli. I'm just picking up on that conversation. Are you saying, Mark, or you as a panel saying that the best tool for an SME to get noticed and compete with the big boys is creativity and ideas?
Yes.
You are?
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. What brands are, they're kind of stuck in their brand personality. They're stuck with they're getting more and more confined by their social media policy, which is getting wrapped up into their communications policy. So as an SME coming up with a big idea, you've got to match it to an audience, and it's got to be engaging to them. But like one of my colleagues said, it's about we are nimble. We can come up with ideas that we're using our own time, so we can test those ideas, and by being creative, that's how you can stand out. If you're boring, you're dead. If you're interesting and original and trying new things and risk-taking and not scared of putting controversial things out there or new things out there, that's the chance you've got against the bigger boys. But they'll change quick if you do too well. So you've got the purple cow, keep coming up with the purple cow. Don't end just because you've had one idea. You've got to have many, many ideas constantly.
It kind of picks up on that notion that the big brands refer to as the small fires, whether it's the Coke and the Mentos through YouTube kind of channels, in terms of to gain interest and widen audience participation. I think through creativity, you can experiment and light one of those fires of low risk to enlighten your brand.
Yeah. And if you monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of that big idea, then you can get slightly better next time. There isn't a silver bullet, unless you're lucky. But
I think we had a question from over here.
Yeah, you kind of asked it actually, which is a bit mean. But I want to come back. Everyone's used the word authentic in variation. So, how authentic can you develop an authentic voice? Because you are really asking everyone to create something artificial, aren't you? But how do you make it really authentic?
Well, we're talking about this notion of trust as well, aren't we? In terms of brands,
Authenticity is but I think that the problem for a big brand is trying to get authenticity, and I hear the kind of tone of voice thing spoken about all the time. But if you're an SME, it's kind of like, well, tone of voice, that's just us, isn't it? And actually, ultimately, I think authenticity for an SME is so much easier to do, because it's just, you have I've worked in businesses of various sizes, and, once you get up, when you're about 8 people, you're pretty much a team everywhere. You don't really need much of a hierarchy. So when you're delivering stuff like social media, you can just be you, really. And I think, the really important thing, I always say, particularly with social, but across everything, all the tools that I've spoken about as well, pick one thing and do it really, really well. And do it properly. If you're taking on, don't just go right. Like obviously the legacy you had to deal with, which was, okay, we've got umpteen Twitter accounts because somebody's heard somewhere that we must be on Twitter. And if we're talking about mobile, somebody will say you must have a responsive site. No, you mustn't. This is a this week's fad. Do what works for you, and just do it really, really well. Do things like, you know, an implementation strategy. So we're going to do this many blogs a week. We're going to try and get out this many tweets a day. You know, and there's actually a rule. It's a 70, 20, 10 rule for Twitter about how much content you do, of which 10% is just kind of what soup of the day stuff. You know, people like to see you being human. I know you got rid of soup of the day, but I think there's an argument to say that
We haven't got rid of
actually,
banter.
right? You've still got
yeah.
the banter, and that's quite important. And actually, that is an important element. So you just kind of be yourself, and you find the people within your organisation who've got the creativity and the ideas. And I think, you know, everybody's creative in some way. It might not be through writing. It might be through pictures. It might be through music. And there are channels out there that all of us can use that will show that off.
And it's bigger than digital. If you're not authentic and really into your business and 100% committed to where you're going, you'll fail anyway, whether it's digital or not. You've got to be so passionate about it in this competitive environment. You know, you've got to be absolutely committed to it working. Digital is just a function of that.
Hello, my name's Peter Murphy. I'm from the Arts Council England, and what I'm interested in is this authenticity connected to the customer, loyal brands, niche, shared interests. We have that in the cultural sector, but we find it really difficult to find revenue models through digital. Is there any sort of commercial models that we could look at or copy? Because, you know, we have that customer base, but we don't have the commercial side to it.
Yeah, would you like to?
I would say everything that we do is about promoting our events programme. We charge tickets to our events programme. Once people have signed up to come to one of our events, they then get our newsletter, which talks about more events coming up. So it's all about building up that very, very valuable database and then promoting to them things that you want them to buy. A ticket to our conference next week is about 100 quid. As an example. So all of the time we're trying to engage with an audience to build up that database to sell something. But I guess, yeah, that's just my model. If you haven't got something in that way to sell and you're looking at making money in other ways, Mark might have an answer.
I think it's fascinating trying to create business models and revenue models, and the music industry is struggling with it, but does it really well. If you're a band, it's not just about selling records. Now there's downloads, gigs, tickets, merch, you know, personal appearances. It's leveraging the assets of the good-looking boy band, but identifying what your assets are and trying to leverage them in every way you can think of. And copying is a really good thing. And you know, venues, they're all struggling. Do we go Asian weddings, normal weddings, gigs? You know, how can you leverage a space? You know, a lot of arts and cultural are destinations and they have space. How do you leverage that space? Morning, lunchtime, tea time, evening, weekends, you know, so it's kind of what are your assets and seeing how you can leverage them to create new business models. I think it's a fascinating subject, one we've wrestled with quite a lot for clients.
Mark?
I think it depends what you want to do. I mean, there is a fairly obvious business model out there because it's so interesting. Because every time I talk to the cultural industries, they say what you say, which has got all these great ideas but no money. And when I talk to brands, they say exactly the opposite, which is that, and I talked about this shift towards content, about how much, so brands are no longer, it's not advertising any longer, it needs to be about engaging through content. And most brands don't have any content, they don't have any ideas. They get people like me along to give them ideas, and they're not always that great. The people who have the really great ideas, the people in the cultural industries. So, and a great example of kind of brand content was the, our Australian guy, Felix Baumgartner, jumping out of a balloon.
With Red Bull.
That was essentially about brand content. It had nothing other than that. The spin-off is but there's a fizzy drink company with a better space program than just about anyone else.
Yeah.
But it was about creating content, and also the other interesting thing about that was a big shift away from traditional television. I mean, I sat there at an event a couple of weeks ago, this Rethink Media event, when they said, yes, television still has live, and I just tweeted, what about the 8 million people who saw it on this event on YouTube? You know, will the next Olympics be going out on YouTube live? So, that aside, brands are desperate for content. They need to work with the cultural industry. They need to understand what makes really good creative content, for want of a better word. And that is the answer, is the connection between the two. Now, do the creative industries want to work with brands? And I would say not always. But then you've got some fantastic examples. You know, I know it's the one that everybody quotes, but Kickstarter, Amanda Palmer, actually being able to raise more than enough money to get her album out there. Admittedly, for every Amanda Palmer, there's probably a dozen people who will never raise their funds on Kickstarter. But maybe, arguably, that's about, you know, the success, the benefit of the culture. So there are new models appearing, but there needs to be a change in the old models, because as I say, I see the two sides, and everybody's complaining about not about each other, but they're moaning about their own thing. And actually, if people are willing to work with brands, if you want to do that, if you want to help sell frizzy drinks and sugary cereals, then they would love to hear from you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Cook and I work for Mac Birmingham, and we're an arts centre with a huge diverse programme. And I had a little wry smile to myself when Anthony was talking about companies who say they appeal to everyone, because I liken us to the NHS. We're kind of cradle to grave care across all kinds of backgrounds. And in the past 2 and a bit years, we've built quite a hefty following on Twitter. And obviously we use hashtags for specific projects and conferences and that sort of thing. But I wonder if the panel think because we have audiences that behave in very different, distinct ways, I wonder if the panel think we've missed a trick by not segmenting our Twitter feeds. Because I sometimes think, you know, we are saying so much all the time because we have so much content. Are we doing the right thing or not?
Ladies first.
So how big's your following?
It's getting on for about 12,000 people now.
Well, I guess I want to say, with a following that big, that you could do some really creative things if you did split it off.
Yeah.
Anything with the word science park in it doesn't get a big following. If one day we had 12,000, I would be delighted. But yeah, if you've got that much, then I agree. I think you can. It can just start to become drivel. There can just be too much of it, and you've obviously got such big audiences to work with there. I'll stop there and hand over to Anthony.
Yeah, I think going back to the old boring, you've got to monitor and evaluate, and you've basically got a CRM, customer relationship management, and you do something and you evaluate how they respond. And if you did want to test a spin-off Twitter feed, you can use the big one to promote the little one, and retweet to your big one to see how it affects the growth in the little one. So again, there's no silver bullet, there's no right answer. It's test, evaluate, test, improve, evaluate, but having 12,000 followers is brilliant. How often do they engage? And being keyword rich, because I can't keep up with a single feed. You segment your feeds. I don't know if civilians, normal, general public segment their feed, but I can't keep up with a Twitter follower. So I use keywords and follow in that way. So again, I would say you need to kind of try and test, tweak, improve.
You're obviously doing something right. I think there's this whole sort of strategic versus tactical debate. So strategic is the big stuff you do, which is like your Twitter feed. And I would do some tactical stuff, but actually experiment with some of the other channels out there and target them to specific audiences. So you can do stuff around Tumblr for your younger audiences, and Pinterest for people who make cupcakes, and whatever it is. And you can just sort of segment that way, and you can play with it in those different ways without actually sort of, but look, it's working, why change it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, can I just answer that as well, because I follow you,
And I would be very disappointed if you did segment off, because I wouldn't be able to follow all of those different feeds. But actually, the cross-fertilization that the Mac have in their diversity is quite interesting. So often I'll stumble across things that you're doing that I wouldn't have been aware of if you had them off in different segments. So I'd personally, as a follower, be disappointed. But also, one of the things about your venue is that a lot of people come to the Mac from Cannon Hill Park, and they stumble across arts and culture almost by accident. And it is the example that I use if I'm ever giving a speech or talking about how to get content and stuff out there to audiences that would never normally find you. You are perfect like that. You don't have your digital elements around the space. So they're not stumbling over those. So you're not growing it in that way. You could be putting it more around.
Actually, that's quite interesting you say that.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I would change about what you're doing. You definitely are missing an opportunity if you're not growing that, because a lot of that stuff that you're getting, you're getting people stumbling over when they're coming into the cafe, for instance, and doing stuff there. So.
Sorry to bring this back to the Mac again, Lindsay, but I know we'll declare an interest because I work with Mac, but I'm going to completely disagree with you, Julia, and you, Mark. But I think this, I want this turning into a question back to the panel, because we're all users of the Mac. I'm a follower of the Mac. I actually use your website much more than I do, and my issue with the Mac Twitter feed is actually the soup of the day issue. That there's always somebody moaning about having to wait in the cafe, so I don't use their Twitter feed. And generally, most of your Twitter feed, not all 12,000, is people I kind of know. So actually, if Mac as a business, Julia and I live 10 minutes apart, and we both use the Mac, both follow them on Twitter. What is the best way for them to look at? Because I do agree with the segmentation. I would rather read a Mac programme, for example, than somebody saying what's on the menu. Yeah. So the soup of the day thing, coming back to, I'm really fascinated by the soup of the day thing. There are things I don't want to read in that Twitter feed as a user. So is there what you mentioned a silver bullet? I don't, and we're literally the same person, Julia and I, and we're using your feed in different ways. We're engaging with the venue digitally, and that's the same as most consumers, really.
Definitely. Well, we're not a homogenous lump who respond in the same way, and what you're trying to find is profitable niches, to use another marketing term. But is it, if you're going to change things, is it working? It's obviously working now. Not everyone's the same. Two best friends are completely different, and you need to try and cater for them. But you're doing a great product, and people love so that helps. If it was a bad product, it would be different. And the great thing about arts organisations is they've got so much content, you can have so much fun that you can do both quite simply. But coming back to being a bit of a marketing Nazi, is it worth doing, and how do you assign your resources for the best use of time? That's a challenge.
Could I just ask a question in that we're all making this assumption that the strategy is working because you've got X amount of followers. How closely are you actually monitoring kind of the stats behind your followers? Could you have had 36,000, 128,000? Are people leaving, or?
No, it's consistently growing. We've benchmarked it against similar venues, and we think we're doing pretty well, particularly regionally. I think we're only behind one of the cultural venues in the West Midlands. But we don't know, and actually our resources are really changing, the balance is changing, and I feel that very much strategically we're constantly being directed, go digital, and I'm really happy to do that, but I need to really think about the best way to do
Can I
that.
just make
to take
a
people
point?
with me.
Yeah, because it's interesting what is being said here, but, and I'm sorry to say this, you are a sample of 2 out of 12,000, and clearly it's working. But do you know what? There's 12,000 people. Why don't you just ask them?
Absolutely.
And that's the other great thing about when we're talking about the level. You can do audience survey really, really quickly.
But if I do ask them, I expect 2 really quick responses.
Could we take the final question of the evening, please?
Sam Lewis from Emma Television. I was just wondering, obviously we're talking about digital media and stuff, and the next big thing that has kind of been on the horizon is 4G, and I guess it kind of ties in to what they're talking about with Mac and that, and this idea of having a digital strategy. But is that just going to change everything? Is that so? For instance, Mark, you mentioned the only 11% of people watch video. Well, not only, but 11% of people watch video on YouTube, for instance, on mobile phones. With 4G, obviously that capability is going to increase. So I was just wondering, basically, what the panel sort of thought about that, really, and in terms of how that's going to impact SMEs.
I'm always flabbergasted every time I work in London in that my 3G is completely crippled, and 3G is completely crippled in terms of networks. But when I first bought into 3G several years ago, it was fast, it was dynamic. I just wonder in terms of whether 4G is just become what 3G once was to a certain extent in terms of our expectations.
Yeah. In short, anything to do with the mobile operators will always turn out to be a great disappointment. I do work very closely with them, don't get me wrong, and a lot of it is, without getting too deep into the argument, the operators have a really, really big problem because they plan 3G. So 3G, just to give you, it's helpful if I just give you a 30-second history. 3G, £24 billion was raised from this mad bidding by the operators. That was enough to give the Labour government, Gordon Brown could then give tax cuts, which then got them re-elected. So 3G got them re-elected. They planned on the basis, and who does this remind me of? The banks, that their revenues would go that way. But actually, the revenues are flatlined, and it's bleeding obvious when you look at it, which is that we've all got a phone now. We're all on the tariff we want, whatever it is, 25, 35 quid a month. We want a smartphone every couple of years. So it's flatlined. Data usage has gone through the roof. They're actually having trouble rolling out 4G. So if you go on the EE one, you get, basically, the amount they give you is the equivalent of about an hour a week of video. That's it, on that tariff. So basically, consumers are expecting 4G within their plan at no additional cost. And the operators are desperately trying to sell more because they never recoup their 24 billion pounds, and they're still really upset about it. So great decision from Ofcom to sort of bring it back and go, let's open it up. So you're right, we need super fast networks. And this is something that is holding the UK back. So Peru has better 4G than we do. There are massive pipes being built up the side of West Africa, which is allowing stuff like 4G technology to be implemented there really, really quickly. So everybody's going to leapfrog over us, and it is going to be a massive barrier, you're quite right, particularly as we move towards much more sort of content-driven experience on mobile. But the 4G as we see it now will not deliver it, and we're way off from that. Another 2-3 years, if at all.
Mark, do you feel that kind of service providers such as giffgaff, for instance, will shake up the marketplace? So they're operating on O2's service provision.
Yeah. I mean, again, that will be remain to be seen, but that kind of model. But it's going to get very, very interesting. The other part of it, which I'm a really big fan of, is just open Wi-Fi. So brands should be providing Wi-Fi as part of that experience. When I land at the airport in any country, I should just open my phone. There should be some Wi-Fi. They actually did a study, 72% of people said that they would happily take a bit of advertising in return for that free Wi-Fi. So I don't mind landing at the airport. Yeah, here's your taxi firm, you can book with us. Now get on and download your emails or whatever. And doing that, and there is a move towards that. So Tesco's have got it, John Lewis are doing it, so Delta Airlines have piloted it actually on planes. So there's much more move to do that, and that will probably solve the data problem. And brands particularly want to deliver content are best to do it by just providing some decent Wi-Fi. And then you get to do really interesting stuff like you can do precise positioning in store. So as somebody's going around the store, you can go, oh, and here's your really nice offer for, 2 for 1 on a pint of Smirnoff or whatever it is, and that kind of stuff. And you can be quite clever with that as a brand. But the benefit as a consumer is that you actually get to see all this content that's out there.
Awesome.
I was quite excited about 4G before he just said
operators will always be a great disappointment.
Yeah. So I like the idea of that because giving richer content wherever you are is a great marketing opportunity for us agencies, and if you can deliver in video what we can only deliver in 2D now on screen, then I was a few minutes ago really excited about 4G. I think there's a big opportunity for SMEs in Birmingham, and I think there's a lag behind the content that we're ready and have the capacity and capability to do, and the knowledge and the bravery to try these interesting bits of content. The 4G will be here before and there'll be a lag before anyone gets to use it properly, but maybe they can't use it properly, and
well, I think it's primarily in revenue models, and it's only a small rollout at the minute. I mean, the actual licenses haven't been issued, and this is partly the government, but the operators don't want to buy the licenses because of what happened last time. So nobody, but they know ultimately it's in the business interest. I mean, one of the best things that could happen is if Birmingham, sadly there's nobody here from who represents it, but if Birmingham Council basically turn around and say, do you know what, we're going to make this into a super fast broadband city, people will use it, and business and brands will come.
I'm not from the council, but obviously Digital Birmingham are one of our partners, and they are actually investing in the Smart City Commission to look at this Smart City, 4G.
Yeah, but they kind of need to do it like now, sort of next week.
Well, no, that will be next year. So.
Okay. So we're kind of coming back to this notion of internet killed the video star. Kind of where do we watch our content? How do we engage with it? Everything from kind of event-based media, from crowdsourcing in terms of funding your projects, etc. Finally, I would just like to thank the panel for a really stimulating discussion this evening. So thank you to Mark, to Anthony, and also to Charlotte. Thank you.